welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on, well, a really challenging and controversial claim. It fundamentally tries to rewrite the origin story of racial terror in the Americas. We're diving into Frank Rodriguez's text, The Moor Who Taught the Devil How Empire Became Ritual Death.
Yeah, and this source material is definitely designed to provoke. It puts forward a very specific argument.
Which is?
That the infrastructure, the how-to of modern public suppression, the methods for these visible, almost theatrical punishments, including the rope, that this wasn't independently invented by European colonizers. The claim is it was a systemic protocol transmitted to them.
Transmitted from the Moorish Empire.
That's the core argument, yes. Transmitted from the Moors.
Wow. Okay, so the mission for us today is forensic, really. We need to follow Rodriguez's argument, trace the path of that methodology.
Exactly.
How did this legal scaffolding, which apparently served one purpose under the Moorish throne, get stolen, violently inverted, and then transformed into lynching, white supremacist terror?
And crucially, why does that history of transmission remain so deliberately obscured even today? The source suggests the silence isn't accidental, it's ongoing.
Okay, let's unpack this. So to really get this idea of transmission, we first need to understand the empire that supposedly designed the blueprint. Rodriguez calls the Moors empire architects.
And for a good reason. We're talking about control over significant parts of Spain, Portugal, North Africa, stretching from the early 8th century, 711 CE, right up to 1492. A long time.
So not just conquerors, but state builders.
Sophisticated state builders, absolutely. And central to any successful empire, especially one that large and diverse, is a visible, effective system of legal control.
Right, you need order.
You need order. And Rodriguez documents that the Moorish courts, especially in Al-Andalus places like Cordoba, Seville, Granada, they use structured public punishment.
Like what specifically?
Well, everything from public flogging to hanging. But the key, according to the text, is that these were tools to enforce hierarchy and order within their society, which was multi-ethnic.
So not aimed at one specific group based on race.
No, the argument is these were legal tools of empire, applied based on law, not race as we understand it now. They maintain the structure of the Moorish state itself.
Okay, but here's the question I imagine you, the listener, might be thinking, and I'm thinking it too. Public hangings, gruesome punishments, weren't those kind of common everywhere back then?
That's a fair question.
How does Rodriguez make the case this was specifically taught by the Moors, not just, parallel development in Europe?
Right, and that's where the author focuses on the protocol, not just the act of hanging, but the whole system around it.
The system?
Yeah, the systemic integration. We're talking centralized legal records of these punishments. Specific designs for the execution apparatus, the gallows, the scaffolds, and even how these spectacles were integrated into city planning. It's about the structure, the legal and architectural blueprint.
Ah, okay, so it's the formalization, the methodology.
Precisely. The source lays out a timeline for this legal osmosis, if you will.
Okay, let's hear that timeline. How did this absorption happen?
Well, it starts not long after 711 CE with the arrival of this African Islamic imperial system in Iberia. Fast forward through the 800s on thousands, Moorish cities like Cordoba become huge centers of learning and law.
Famous centers.
Yeah. Then around the 10th, 11th centuries, you see European scholars start visiting Moorish Spain. Think precursors to universities like Paris, Oxford.
And they're not just there for the cool architecture or the rediscovered Greek texts.
Exactly. They're studying governance. How do you run a large, complex, centralized state? Part of that is absorbing the legal scaffolding.
Including the punishment protocol.
Including the public discipline methods. The text notes that by the 1100s, 1300s, these emerging Christian kingdoms in Europe start to systematically mimic those specific Moorish laws and rituals around public punishment.
So they saw it worked for the Moors as a tool of state power.
And they adopted it. The practice of using public spectacle to normalize state authority gets transmitted through legal study, through observation, through adoption.
So the rope, the structure, the whole public ritual. It starts with the throne, the Moorish throne, and gets passed on like a technology of power. Centuries before Europe really dominates globally.
The structure was established, transmitted.
And that structure then leads us right to the breaking point.
1492. Yeah, what's fascinating here is how the structure was then Well, radically altered. 1492 is pivotal. Expulsion of the Moors from Spain.
Reconquista finishes.
Right. And Christian Europe is simultaneously absorbing and, you could say, appropriating these Moorish methods of control. The structure, the public spectacle, the gallows, it stays recognizable.
Where the purpose changes.
Violently inverted. That's the core of the shift.
Rodriguez calls this the devil's inversion. So, if the Moors used it for imperial law and order across their diverse population, how do we pinpoint the change? When does it become purely racial terror? What's the fundamental difference?
The difference is absolutely critical. It lies in the target and the function. Under the Moors in Spain, the punishment, however harsh, was about upholding the state's hierarchy. It applied to violators of imperial law, whatever their background, because the empire itself was diverse.
Okay, law-based, theoretical.
Theoretically law-based, yes. But when that protocol, that blueprint, gets exported, particularly to the Americas.
And what happens?
The colonizer takes the scaffolding, but completely repurposes it. Starting really in the 1600s, that structure gets applied specifically, viciously, almost exclusively to enforce white supremacy.
And the chattel slave system.
And the chattel system. Lynching wasn't about law anymore. It became a raw tool of terror. Its function was to deny the humanity of black people and maintain racial hierarchy through fear.
So the victims are no longer criminals under state law, however flawed that law might be. They become symbols.
Exactly.
The source is just devastating on this. Innocent black men, women, children targeted, often for completely fabricated reasons or vague accusations. The point wasn't justice, not even twisted justice. It was psychological warfare against an entire community. No trial, no defense, no due process, just terror.
And the scale. The authors document the scale of this transformation. If you look at the period, say, between 1882 and 1968, that's relatively recent history.
Okay.
We have documentation for 4,743 lynchings just in the U.S.
4,700.
Yeah.
And the racial aspect proves the inversion, right?
Absolutely starkly. Of those thousands of documented victims, a staggering 72%, that's 3,446 people, were black.
3,400.
And these are often classified as terror lynchings. The term itself tells you the purpose. Acts designed specifically to traumatize whole communities, enforce economic control, social subjugation.
So the colonizer took this inherited system,
Weaponized it, turned an imperial tool of order into an engine of racial genocide and control.
and by pretending it was just, some kind of spontaneous frontier justice or necessary evil, they used the inherited blueprint as a kind of shield. They hid the fact that they'd stolen and twisted the design.
Exactly. They refused to acknowledge the historical debt, let's call it, to the Moorish system. And that refusal made the racial terror seem like a uniquely American thing, maybe an organic response to perceived threats.
Rather than what Rodriguez argues it was, a calculated, repurposed methodology of control with a documented lineage.
A lineage they actively worked to obscure.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. This denial, this obscuring, it wasn't just passive forgetting, it involved actively destroying the evidence, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about the missing archive.
Right, this is the third pillar of the argument in the text, the denial protocol. If you want your violence to seem original, necessary, maybe even righteous.
You can't let people know you copied the homework, basically.
Essentially, yes, especially if the homework was from an empire you just defeated and demonized. So, post-1492, there's a systematic effort to erase the origins of the blueprint, libraries seized, Arabic manuscripts burned, and crucial texts on law, on governance, the very things that showed how the Moors ran their state. They were suppressed or very selectively translated.
So maybe you translate the astronomy, the mathematics, things that seem useful and non-threatening.
Precisely. Keep the science, maybe some philosophy.
But the detailed legal codes, the protocols for public execution, for centralized punishment, the stuff that actually reveals the methodology of imperial power.
That had to vanish, or at least be buried.
Why? What was the gain?
The gain was immense. It allowed the colonizer, centuries later in the Americas, to claim that their system of racial terror, like lynching, was an invention. Maybe a crude, regrettable necessity born of chaos.
Not an inheritance.
Yeah.
Not a deliberate application of a sophisticated non-European imperial technology.
Exactly. They needed to obscure the teacher to justify the later crime, erase the source code.
And this erasure connects to another concept in the text, one that's maybe more abstract but feels really important. The interruption of supreme mathematics. What is that?
Yeah. That's a fascinating part of the argument. Supreme mathematics is described in the source as something older, a pre-711 CE philosophical framework. almost like a form of divine logic, a system for cultural clarity, understanding reality, purpose, order, particularly within African and ancient Islamic traditions.
Like a worldview, a way of making sense of things.
A cipher for community clarity, as the text puts it, before the imposition of large-scale imperial hierarchy.
Okay, so a kind of original understanding.
The argument is that the Moorish Empire itself had already begun to sideline this older system. They replaced that kind of organic spiritual clarity with their own centralized, top-down imperial law for control.
Makes sense for an empire.
But then the European colonizer comes along and completes the erasure by suppressing not just the Moorish legal system's origins, but also any remnants of this deeper cultural logic.
They create confusion.
They enforce confusion as a tool of control, especially among enslaved populations. You cut people off from their own historical, intellectual, spiritual roots, make it harder for them to resist or build alternatives.
That's profound. It's not just controlling the body with the rope, but controlling the mind by destroying the archive, the ways of knowing.
And the text argues this denial, this erasure, continues right up to today. It's quite critical of the contemporary refusal to acknowledge the full history.
Specifically calling out modern Moorish sovereignty movements.
Yes, it acknowledges their focus on history, greatness, sovereignty, which are powerful and important. But the criticism is that in focusing almost exclusively on the glories, the math, the architecture, the Golden Age, they often refuse to reckon with the suppression systems they also developed and, according to Rodriguez, passed down.
So they protect a cleaner image of the empire.
Protect the myth of an empire untouched by blood, as the source puts it. It states pretty directly that there is still no formal acknowledgement from many of these contemporary institutions about the transmission of these specific suppression protocols.
Why does that silence matter now in 2025? According to the author, what are the consequences?
The consequences are tangible, the argument goes. Because if the origins are obscured, if nobody fully owns the lineage, the structure itself survives.
Oh.
It persists in modern institutional forms. The methodology of control adapts. Think about how police brutality is often defended, maintaining order.
Right.
Think about legal inequalities shielded by appeals to tradition or precedent. Institutional neglect acting as a slow, bureaucratic version of public spectacle.
So the function remains, even if the form changes. The rope becomes, what, biased sentencing, underfunded schools, mass incarceration.
The argument is yes. The rope has changed form, but not its core function of control and suppression. That original blueprint, designed by one empire, stolen and distorted by another, remains embedded in our structures today because the historical record was deliberately broken. And it raises a really tough question, doesn't it? If real accountability means fully recognizing where things came from and how they were twisted, then what happens when there's silence? Silence from the descendants of the original architects and continued denial from the descendants of those who stole and weaponized the plans. How does that silence allow the structure itself to keep doing harm?
This has been, a profoundly illuminating and definitely difficult deep dive into this work by Frank Rodriguez. We've tried to trace that claimed methodology of control from the legal scaffolding of the Moorish throne through its horrific inversion into racial terror under colonialism.
Devil's inversion.
And into this present-day silence, this alleged denial protocol that lets the blueprint keep operating.
Yeah, the scroll, as Rodriguez terms his text, it really reads like a forensic indictment. It forces a confrontation with a very uncomfortable historical complexity.
Which is?
That the architecture for the system that became arguably the defining feature of American white supremacy was sourced. It wasn't just invented out of thin air. It names the Moors as architects of a structure and the colonizer as a thief who twisted that structure into something genocidal.
Heavy stuff. The source material ends quite powerfully with the declaration. The reckoning has begun. So, for you, the listener, maybe the provocative thought to leave with is this. What does active reckoning actually look like? Especially when we grapple with the idea that our most brutal systems might be inherited, repurposed, not just invented. If the original archive was burned, as Rodriguez claims, what tools do we need now to truly uncover the foundations of inequality and finally dismantle that inherited structure?